Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is a book entitled Jesus' Words Only, or Was Paul the Apostle Jesus Condemns in Revelation 2, verse 2. And the reason I titled it or subtitled it that way was the number one argument I thought at that time was the book of Revelation, chapter 2, because Jesus is ascended to heaven. He's speaking to John, his apostle. There's no doubt it was John who wrote this book of Revelation. It's written about 67 Christian era. And so Paul is dead. So there's no argument that, Paul was correcting Jesus if Jesus is correcting Paul. That's the argument that Jesus was, when Paul came, he was bringing corrections that Jesus gave to him in Revelation. Well, then John's going to have a revelation from Jesus, which trumps Paul's claimed revelation. And the beauty of this is that it was done subtly. And it was only really in the 1800s when anyone really put this two and two together. As far as we know, there could have been people in the early church who could easily recognize this, and that would explain, for example, why Justin Martyr, and there is no Christian voice, including the leading one, Justin Martyr, who even talks about Paul. He's not even mentioned from the time Justin Martyr shows up in the scene, from 100 to 165. He writes 27 books, and he doesn't even mention Paul by name, and he just preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ and the Sermon on the Mount and all these things. So anyway, let's get into it, and you'll see why I think this is a very important argument. And if you're on the fence and you're trying to decide, hey, there's choice out between two masters, Paul, my master, having superseded Jesus because Jesus allowed him to, or did Jesus kick him in the and punch him in the face in the book of Revelation? That's a big difference, right, from what you might be thinking. All right, so let's go into it. So we're going to start with the first point of Revelation 2, verse 2, which is that the church at Ephesus had determined someone was claiming they were an apostle, but they're not. They're false, and they were determined to be lying about it. And who could that be? So we're going to do a forensic audit. So let's see where we'd start on that. All right, so the number one way God always said to determine canon is Deuteronomy 13, 1-5. And then 2 John 1:9 gives another example of how you're to determine canon. Deuteronomy 13, 1-5. If a prophet arises and gives you a sign or wonder, signs and wonders, isn't that a proof that you're from God? That's what Paul claims, but that's not what God says. And the sign or wonder comes true. So a prophecy or some sign that they said they were going to do, they did it. Is that how you determine someone's from God? No. But he says, if that same person says, let us go after other gods, you must not listen to the words of that prophet. I would say if it even says go after other teachers that if I've sent a teacher and somebody is telling you, no, don't listen to that guy, listen to this other person. Same idea. And by the way, in Deuteronomy, it goes on to say that those who turn you away from God's law are in the same category. And this is a rule called the rule of apostasy. Now let's look at 2 John 1:9. Whoever goes beyond and does not remain in the teaching of Christ does not have God. So if you start as a Christian and you get derailed and you're following Paul and you didn't realize it's not the same person and you were told they are, you're going to get a wake-up call here, because Jesus is going to hit you over the head with some points that you have to deal with because they're not easy to address and just dismiss quickly. That you have to do a lot of research to see if you can even get around any of these 4 points. There's several points here. All right, so what did these two passages prove? There's a biblical standard. Prophetic validity is never established by signs and wonders alone, contrary to what Paul claims. It is established by absolute doctrinal continuity with prior revelation. Then the ultimate filter for orthodoxy in a Christian world is Jesus' words. Matthew 24, verse 35. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So nobody can come and say, we once knew Christ in the flesh, but we know him that way no longer, and now we move on. That's 2 Corinthians 5:13. No. John 8:51. If anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. Does it say keep the words that Paul gave you, which never quotes Jesus in any of his epistles? Never. Look it up. Did he ever actually quote Jesus talking to him in heaven, and then he's relaying that message? If he's repeating something Jesus already said, which the only argument people say is he used the words worker worthy of his wage. He didn't even attribute it to Jesus, and it's not necessarily something Jesus was the only person who would ever said that. Anyway, so he never quotes Jesus, and that's the person you're going to rely upon. I have a feeling that God's going to ask you this hard question. Why would you follow someone who never quotes my son? You say he's your master, but you don't notice the fact that Paul doesn't treat Jesus as his master, the Jesus of earth. Exhibit A, the claim of authority in Asia. This is from the letter to the Ephesians. Paul is going to make a claim about himself. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God to God's holy people in Ephesus. Ephesus is the capital of Asia. Asia Minor sometimes it's called, but it's Asia, and that's a region inside of modern Turkey. The faithful in Christ Jesus. Ephesians 1, verse 1. So Paul explicitly has asserted apostolic jurisdiction over the church at Ephesus. He presents himself as a foundational authority to this specific congregation. And just so you know, nowhere in the book of Acts is Paul called an apostle of Jesus Christ. People can be called apostles, but that's a word in Greek that just means you're a messenger. So he was a messenger from Antioch. But it says he's a messenger of Antioch. It never says in the Acts he's an apostle of Jesus Christ. So who's the only person ever says he's an apostle of Jesus Christ? Oh, Paul himself, a self-declaimed apostle. So let's see how that works out. Well, the next piece of evidence has to be considered first before we get to decision. Exhibit B, the sudden defection. Now, Paul is going to make an admission in 2 Timothy 1:15. You know that everyone in the province of Asia, remember the capital of Asia is Ephesus, has deserted me, including Phygelus and Hermogenes. So he is admitting nobody is following him. They've rejected him. Now, what's the right analysis of that? What's the thing to take away from that? The forensic anomaly is mentioned there on the right box. Paul does not claim the Asians, Ephesus and the region around him, abandoned Christ. Paul does not claim the Asians abandoned Christ. He explicitly states they abandoned him. Ephesus was the capital of the province of Asia. The congregation rejected Paul's jurisdiction, not Christ. Keep that in mind. Next is Exhibit C in our examination of Paul, and this is called the Divine Commendation. And this is our Lord Jesus speaking in Revelation 2, chapter 2. He says, to the angel of the church in Ephesus, Paul had been claiming to be an apostle to the church of Ephesus, if you remember, write the following. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance, and that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them false or liars. He's going to commend them for that, okay? So Paul claimed, how does this fit Paul? Paul claimed to be an apostle to Ephesus. So clearly, this can include Paul. Ephesus rejected him. That's a fact. Why did they reject him? Well, if he's the one they found to be a liar, that is what Jesus is talking about. Somebody who claimed to be an apostle at Ephesus rejected this person as a false apostle. Didn't reject Christ, just rejected the false apostle, one claiming falsely to be apostle of Jesus. Jesus then is commending that church at Ephesus for exposing a false apostle. So we're going to find out if the church at Ephesus in Asia had made a good decision, and what would have been the predicate. How would they know who is and isn't an apostle? They would know the number, wouldn't they? They would know, is there 10 or 12 or 13 or 14? Can a lot of people be apostles? And the answer is no. Apostles of Jesus Christ is a specific category of apostle, and there's a very finite number. So if you remember in Acts 1, Jesus ascends, and at the end of Acts chapter 1, the apostles appoint Matthias to be the replacement for Judas Iscariot. And they did that with the blessing of Jesus because they prayed, and they had Jesus pick it through the lots. So that's a normative way of doing decisions. And anyway, that's what happened, and that's who the 12 apostles are. And so there you have it. And there's going to be no other apostle added, as you'll see here. If you take a look at the wall of the city of Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem that comes down from heaven, the wall has foundation stones, and they're numbered, and there's going to be 12. And if you see, you can see the number in Roman numerals, and it only ends with XII, which is the number 12. And here's the box to the right, the design of this wall. The wall of the city had 12 foundations. This is a quote actually from Revelation 21:14. And on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. That's it, only 12. The thrones Jesus promised, exactly 12 thrones for judging the 12 tribes of Israel. He said that in Matthew 19:28. So it fits exactly what he said on earth, what he said from heaven to John, and demonstrated, giving him the vision of the New Jerusalem with these 12 foundation stones. It would actually probably go around in a more circular region, or whatever the territory would be occupied. But there's only 12 foundation stones, and they represent the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So you have, therefore, the divine architecture is a closed system. The rule of 12 governs the foundation of the church. Can't change it. We can't do it. Paul can add another person. He's not allowed to do that. A self-proclaimed apostle would be what? False and a liar. That's what Jesus is saying in Revelation 2. All right, so simple math dictates the outcome here. There's a missing 13th. There is no 13th apostle. Matthias, on the left column, chosen by the 11 remaining apostles and the Holy Spirit via lots, Acts 1, 21-26. We mentioned that already. Check that off. This fulfills the requirement of having been with Jesus from the baptism of John to the ascension. That is a requirement that Paul could never qualify for anyway. Paul would have had to have been someone who was at the baptism of John and would have been with Jesus all the way through the ascension. And Paul was in neither of these two territories or events. So only Matthias, competing with one other candidate, could restore the foundation number to exactly 12. And that's what Jesus did. And that's what happened in Acts chapter 1. Now let's look to the right. Paul is a self-appointed apostle via an unwitnessed contradictory vision. I mean, he says, men heard no one, and they did hear no, they heard someone, and then, it's conflicting through and through. Now, Paul admits he is not one of the 12. He even refers to them distinct from himself. Paul gives an order of appearances of Jesus in the flesh in 1 Corinthians 15, relying on tradition because he wasn't there. He says it first appeared to so on and so on and so on, then to the 12, and then to James, and then lastly myself. So in that context, when he said the 12, that means he understood himself not to be part of the 12. So there's no argument that he ever had a conception he was one of the 12. He was a self-appointed 13th apostle of Jesus Christ when there is no such possible number. So as the slide reads at the bottom, the conclusion is a 13th foundational stone breaks the architectural design of the New Jerusalem. So there is no possibility Paul is a true apostle of Jesus Christ. So the people of Ephesus were complimented by Jesus for finding someone claiming to be an apostle at Ephesus. And we have proof Paul in Ephesians 1:1 claimed to be an apostle of Jesus Christ at Ephesus, writing to the Ephesians. Jesus commends them for finding that person a false apostle and a liar. I decided to do a little research on this to find the first person who ever came up with this theory in the modern era prior to Renan saying the same thing in 1875. So this is 1869. I found the person, and he's a pro-Paul person. And I thought to share this with you would be helpful because you'll see he's going to admit everything except he's going to change it from Jesus speaking to just John, and then he's going to deride the Jewish leadership. And so you just can dismiss this as a negative against Paul. But listen to what Max Krenkel in Paulus der Apostel der Eiden, he was German, he writes at page 131 of that book. And the irreconcilable fanaticism which took hold of the Jewish Christian party, he'll identify it as John in a second, is testified to most loudly by the revelation of John, written in Ephesus, which a full decade later praises the angel of the community there because he could not bear evil men and had tested those who called themselves apostles without being so and found them to be liars. That Paul called himself an apostle without being one was indeed the crime which the Judaizers could never forgive him. So in other words, John is now derided as a Jewish Christian who's a Judaizer, and that's why he's saying these things. But he's not going to claim that Paul's an apostle because he isn't. Okay, so that's important. Now, he says this again in his second book, and it's also very interesting. All right, so now we're going to take a look at a later book by the same author, Mr. Krenkel. It was called Der Apostel Johannes, Berlin, 1871, pages 105 to 106. He writes, when John praises the Ephesian church party because it has tested those who call themselves apostles without being so, and has found them to be liars, he speaks as clearly as the apocalyptic form permits. His judgment on Paul is expressed. And he, John himself, does not conceal from us that the party that rejected Paul's apostleship attacked him most fiercely precisely in Ephesus. Max Krenkel, Der Apostel Johannes, 1871, at 150-106. So he's clearly been the first person in two different books to do this, totally pro-Paul. And you can see instead of saying Jesus himself did not conceal who this was, it's now John, and they're Jewish Christians who are Judaizers, okay? So this is how they dealt with it when they saw it, but they don't deny that it was true. And that's why it's an admission by the party of Paul, that this is really unavoidable, that Paul was being condemned by Jesus Christ if you just read it on its face and you don't use these games where they change it from Jesus to John and start smearing him as a Judaizer and so on. There's a little bit more of that quote I wanted to include from Max Krenkel. He says, "On the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem," meaning Revelation 21:14, John, I would say Jesus, sees only the names of the 12 immediate disciples of Jesus emblazoned. There is no place there for the apostle to the Gentiles. Max Krenkel. All right, so I think I made my point already, is this is the only way they can deflect it, by just not even telling you it's Jesus speaking. They just make you think it's a man named John. He's a Judaizer. He's a Jewish Christian. And just like Renan did in 1875, he started to make this claim that the apostles hated Paul and, they're the bad guys and Paul's a good guy. And you make the decision. I think we should all go with what Renan did in the end. In that book called St. Paul in 1875, it was 326 pages of just virulent attack on the 12 apostles. And then ultimately, Renan just folded. And he said, you know what? Now that I think about it, Paul is a hidden rock, and he's been a stumbling block for Christians from the beginning. There it is. Yet he didn't want to get rid of all that work he had done, so he kept that. And then he showed the transformation at the end, where he couldn't stomach what he himself was trying to sell to us. And yet here's the first person who did it, Mr. Krenkel. He was the first one to do this. He had to absorb this information, had to communicate it to us because he's a scholar, and yet he's going to debunk it by just not using Jesus' name and just say it's John. And even here, if you look at the verse, he doesn't say 12 immediate apostles of Jesus. No, he says 12 immediate disciples of Jesus. So John is just part of the disciples. No, he's no longer even apostle. See what he did? He's just playing games. And this is what these people do. They can't deal with facts. So this is how they play the game. All right. So now the next category of proof is going to be about same city, same region, Asia, Ephesus, the capital. And this is a profile of a false prophet of Asia. And Jesus calls this person Balaam, or a new type of Balaam, in Revelation 2:14. And if you look there on the left side, profile 1, Balaam doctrine, Revelation 2:14, a prophet converted by a vision on a road. So Jesus picks a guy who in Jewish history was a prophet converted by a vision on a road. And Balaam also taught you could eat meat sacrificed idols, like you'll see Paul does. And this Balaam induced spiritual antinomianism, meaning anti-God's law, don't follow it. So you have a perfect example of exactly who Paul is in history in the Bible, Balaam. And Jesus uses that to say a new Balaam is in town. And when Balaam exposed himself as being a false prophet and teaching eating meat sacrificed idols and God's law doesn't have to be followed, and taught people to sin against God's law, what happened? Moses had him executed. So he's not a good guy. So Jesus is not citing an example prophet. No, a prophet who's true, really true originally, and then falls into antinomianism, anti-God's law, and in teaching you can eat meat sacrificed idols. So Jesus was very selective in what he was using as an example. And it just does also prove also the case against Paul. He fits exactly Balaam of the original law and prophets. Now, Jesus gave us enough in profile 2 of another category to look at to help us also see it's about Paul. And it was called the Nicolaitans in Revelation 2:15. Now, most scholars made all kinds of speculations. Is it a guy named Nicholas? Was it a deacon? Who are these people? And actually, it wasn't until Lightfoot I think it was around the mid 1700s, he said, wait a minute, this is an Aramaic term, Nicola. And so fits the category here where these people were telling people you can eat whatever you want. You can eat meat sacrificed idols, which were prohibited in the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council conference, and also repeated in Acts 23 in a discussion with Paul. And so the Nicolaitans really mean people who said, let us eat basically whatever we want. They're licentious when it comes to eating meat sacrificed idols in particular. So the description here, this is going to come from Roberts. We'll see this in a minute. An early sect, Nicolaitans were at least this much, without knowing what Nicolaitan meant. And we'll get into why would John have used an Aramaic term. You'll see why it's an Aramaic term. Nicola is an Aramaic for let us eat. And then, but Roberts points this out. It was an early sect promoting grace without law. So he could see what was going on here, okay, when you read the whole chapter 2. And the Nicolaitans taught that physical actions like eating idol meat do not impact spiritual salvation. So, yeah, sure, so what? The demons are being blessed into the food. You can eat it because the idol's nothing. And no, that's not how Jesus feels about it. And that's not how Balaam didn't do a good job with that either. So he was executed as well by Moses for that reason and other reasons. All right, so you've seen profile 1, profile 2. So the question is, who in the New Testament era matches the exact behavioral and doctrinal profile that's depicted in profile 1 and 2? It's a no-brainer. All right, so now let's go into the issue of who were the Nicolaitans. What does that term mean? So Dr. Eli Lizorkin Eisenberg, in an article called Who Were the Nicolaitans, resurrected John Lightfoot's comment. I'm going to show you Wikipedia will give a reference to where it comes from. So he says here, the Aramaic word Nicola means let us eat. Thus, the Greek word Nicolaitans was formed from the Aramaic Nicola, combined with the Greek plural ending TANS. The basic meaning of Nicolaitans, therefore, would be let us eaters. Let us be lettuce eaters. Now, the Christian Hebraist, that means a Hebrew scholar, John Lightfoot argued that Nicolaitans was a form of Aramaism, so an Aramaic term. In this case, Aramaism is not a Greek word, but a loan word originating in Aramaic but spelled Greek. Now we're going to see, why would John be thinking and writing in Aramaic? I'll get to that in a second. I want to show you this Wikipedia article, Nicolaism. It'll tell you Lightfoot wrote that statement about the word Nicola, meaning let us eat, is the source of the Nicolaitan term in the Aramaic language that John was likely speaking. We'll get into the likelihood of that in a second. But it also gives you the citation to HOR.HEB in Acts of Apostles. So he must have written a work called Acts of Apostles of some sort of commentary. And then inside there was this reference to HOR.HEB, meaning some sort of subtitle or subchapter. So anyway, it can be found if you want to locate it. But now, after Lightfoot wrote what he wrote in the 1700s, it didn't have the internet in that era. So there was a way of people not remembering or knowing somebody found something material. So Robertson just simply tells you what is the depiction Jesus is making of this group. And he says it fits early Gnostics. Those are people who believe you're saved by just knowing a mystery. And that's what Paul teaches, by the way, the mysteries of the deep things of God and so on and so forth. These early Gnostics, the Nicolaitans, practiced licentiousness, so they want to eat whatever they want. They don't have to follow any rules. They can eat meat with blood in it. They can eat sacrificed idols, all this kind of stuff, since they were not under the law, but under grace. This is his words. I'll show it to you in a minute. I'm going to actually crop it out. Now, you can actually look at all of Robertson's Bible commentaries at studylight.org. He's a top-notch Protestant mainstream, and there is the language underneath there, but I'm going to actually pull it out so you can see it. All right, so I've copied at studylight.org the commentary on this particular passage of Revelation, and it begins this way. And anything in black I'm going to read here, but anything grayed out is not necessary to read. Taught Balak. What did that mean? It was Balaam's habit as the prototype of all corrupt teachers. So that's an explanation of that. But please notice it's Balaam is corrupt. Okay, so it's a figure in the law and the prophets that you can go back and study, or you can also read some of the historical records on him, and you'll find out why Jesus picked him out of that to parallel to this other figure teaching the Nicolaitans to eat whatever they want. And then Robert says, these early Gnostics, people who believe you're saved by just knowing things, practiced licentiousness, meaning they're permitted to do whatever they want, as a principle, since they were not under law. So they're antinomian, but they're under grace. So if you know 1 Corinthians 15, 1-5, you'd know that Paul says, if you believe and steadfastly hold in your mind that Jesus died, buried, and was resurrected, you shall be saved. And no other condition. That's it. You just believe in some facts and you're going to be saved. That's pure Gnosticism. So Jesus has picked him out of the hat and is condemning him over and over again in this passage. Now, I'm going to put something in here that is because I get tons of response when I did this a couple of years ago that, oh my gosh, we all know that this was a deacon named Nicholas and all this kind of stuff, not realizing it's just made up stuff. People had to make some suggestion of what it was about. But that's not what's going on. John can't speak Greek and he can't write in Greek. And you're going to say, but wait about the book of John, the Gospel of John. That's perfect Greek. That's excellent Greek. Yes, it's very good Greek, but he did not physically. That is a translation by Papias himself. Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis. He says, I was his amanuensis for writing that book, the Gospel. I translated it from his terms, his language, meaning Aramaic Hebrew, and I put it into Greek. That's where it came from. Not a mystery. That's in the Toledo Bible as a preface from the 700s. Somehow that might be not as popularly well known, but that's the real reason why John's Gospel from 95, 96 Christian era reads so much better in Greek than it does when you read the book of Revelation in Greek, which is really this messed up kind of Aramaic Greek. So I just want to show you this is a clear fact. R.H. Charles just documents this in his book called The Critical and Exegetical Commentary on the Revelation of St. John. And this is volume 1. It was first published in 1920. You can find it online, a reprint in 1950. But he explains to you that basically, if you read these notes here, page XXI of the preface, he will explain to you that this was a Galilean man. He emigrated to Asia Minor, where Ephesus is. His knowledge of Greek is defective somewhat, and he kind of created his own Greek grammar on his own, and he used freely remodeling syntactical usages and launched in all unheard of expressions. I'm just paraphrasing it as fast as I can because it's not important to make this a big deal here, but you can see why he would use an Aramaic term and just change it into Latin, to Greek. You just put a Greek ending on it, and it's like you make a pig look a little better by putting like a little bow on it, right? So you put a little Greek ending on it, and it's an Aramaic term. You don't know how to say, let us say, eat in Greek. That's probably what it was. He didn't know how to say that, but he wanted to convey it. I want to read a little bit more from Charles so you can really get a better flavor for the point I'm trying to make. He says this: how then is the unbridled license of his, John's Greek in the book of Revelation, Greek instructions to be explained? Remember, this book is called The Commentary on the Revelation of St. John. He's trying to explain words that he's using. How then is the unbridled license that John is taking with Greek constructions to be explained? The reason, as the present writer hopes to prove, is that while he wrote in Greek, he is writing in Greek, probably with some help. He's in prison. He thought in Hebrew and frequently translated Hebrew idioms literally into Greek. In Galilee, he had no doubt used Aramaic as the ordinary vehicle of intercourse with his fellows, but all his serious studies were rooted in Hebrew. That's really a very important fact. I think a lot of Christians don't realize it, that these guys probably predominantly were thinking in Hebrew and or Aramaic with Hebrew vocabulary. So Aramaic is just really kind of a script and a grammar that you can overlay Hebrew on top of it, so you can have an Aramaic Hebrew. And that's what essentially he was creating. John was creating a maybe a language form that no one had ever saw before, but it was the way people were communicating by melding Aramaic and Hebrew together. And when they had to, they could try to learn how to phonetically change it into Greek letters. And so that's what you're seeing. And this is really a good lesson about where the original Bible came from. It was an Aramaic speaking people, Aramaic Hebrew speaking people. All right, next we're going to have a topic called Doctrinal Collision, Meat, Sacrifice, Idols. What about Paul's doctrine versus the commands of Christ? Pauline doctrine on the left. 1 Corinthians 8, 4-8. Quote, we know that an idol is nothing. Food will not commend us to God. We are neither the worse if we do not eat, nor the better if we do not. The principle he's conveying here is a complete liberty to eat idol meat. It's totally permissible unless it harms a weak conscience. In other words, don't eat it in front of someone who thinks it's wrong. You know it's not wrong for you. You know there's nothing really about it, the idol meat that's problematic. So you can just refrain around those people who you'd be encouraging to do something against their own conscience, although your conscience is totally free to eat the meat. But what does Jesus say about eating sacrifice idols? Revelation 2:14, I have a few things against you. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice Israelites to sin so that they ate food sacrificed idols. Food sacrificed idols doesn't mean you're at the temple. It means you're eating this food that's previously been sacrificed and blessed. That's the whole problem, because it's been blessed with demonic spirits. the principle, it's an absolute prohibition. What Jesus is talking about was absolutely prohibited in Moses' day. It's still absolutely prohibited today. It is a severe sin that warrants divine judgment. Not an easy thing to ignore. All right, now I just want to show you there's a second passage besides 1 Corinthians 8 where Paul also allows eating meat sacrificed to idols. This is 1 Corinthians 10, verses 27 to 28. It reads, verse 27, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered to sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. And if you stop there, you'll make a mistake. You got to keep reading. Verse 29, I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. Someone once read this back to me and said, see, he said you shouldn't eat it for conscience sake. But it says, I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. For why is my freedom, that is to eat meat sacrificed to idols, being judged by another's conscience? So he's absolutely permitting exactly like Balaam did, and exactly like Jesus condemns. No doubt about it. All right, and then there's the great inversion. There's another factor. Remember I said there's 4 factors. We've done 3, now we're up to 4, which is antinomianism, meaning anti-God's law, okay? It's not permissible. It's not any time even imaginable, okay? But yet people think it's okay to just do away with God's law. No. And if you say, oh, but we're in a new covenant, didn't that get rid of the old covenant? No. Read the prophecy of Jeremiah 31, verse 31. I'm going to put the new covenant is I'm going to put my Torah on your heart. That doesn't mean I'm abrogating the Torah. I'm going to make it more memorable, more easy to remember. And that's really Jesus' function, using parables and so on. They're always a reflection of an underlying Torah principle if you pay attention, if you know the Torah. Anyway, Paul's antinomianism, just pay attention. Ephesians 2, 8 to 9. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. So no works, no obedience is necessary. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. So the risk of sinning by having done something that you would potentially try to brag to someone, hey, I gave a big gift to the poor. Yeah, Jesus said, if you do that, you received a reward, but not from God. So that's the whole thing. If you tell people about it, you've lost reward, at least in God's eyes. So if you want to do something, you always try to do it in secret. I mean, obviously the person receiving it knows, but you try to keep it private. Romans 4:4. Now to the one who works, his wage is not credited as a favor, but as what is due. So he's deriding the idea of doing work. So you want to have, he's saying in essence, work in itself is impossible or inconsistent with grace. Paul's error is this. He's giving you a false dichotomy. It's either faith or works when it's both. You have to have faith and works. So that's the question. So you can't not just earn your way to heaven without having faith. So you have to have faith and works. And again, a false dichotomy is tell you it's either faith or works. And it can be something in between, in a sense. It's faith and works. Anyway, but let's listen to Jesus's conditional grace on the right side. Matthew 25, verse 31 to 46, the parable of the sheep and the goats. Eternal life is explicitly granted to those who perform works of charity, and hell is reserved for those who do not. Jesus could not be more clear. Those who called him Lord, Lord, 2 categories. One group didn't do any good charity to the strangers, the poor, the needy, whatever, and the other did charity for those people. And which one goes to heaven? The one who did the work or the one who didn't do the work, even though they both called him Lord, Lord? Well, the one who did the works went to heaven. And Jesus said to the ones who didn't do the charitable works, you're going to go to the same place as the devil and the angels. That couldn't be more clear, just like it says right here. That's salvation not by faith alone, but is it? Revelation 22:12. Behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me to render to every man according to what he has done. So if you've done 0, you just had faith, where are you going to be? James says in 2:24 of James, justification is by works and not by faith alone. So faith just by itself doesn't get you justified. There could be extenuating circumstances if you had very little time and you made a genuine confession and you told your family, give all my wealth to the poor, whatever. There could be extenuating circumstances, but we're looking at the norm. The norm is if you've done nothing, God is going to give you nothing. So why does God make us do that? Why can't He just gives us millions of dollars. He's testing you. It's all about growing up, doing the right thing, learning how to be mature, learning how to be loving to others. God wants that, but you're told, no, we don't have to do that. It's all optional. If we try to do that, we might boast. Forget about it. Just don't boast. Just like Jesus said, don't tell anyone the gifts you're making. Just I'm using this as an example. So nobody can process this. Jesus may already explained this. You can do good works without telling anyone about it. Why do you have to do good works that you tell anyone about? So don't boast. You can do still the good works. It's so obvious. Anyway, let's continue. All right, there's one more condition in conditional grace that I wanted to read to you, and that's Revelation 22, verse 14. Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life. So remember when Jesus was asked how to have eternal life, he answers a young man and he says, obey the commandments. And he says, which ones? He starts rattling off the 10 commandments. And then the man said, what else must I do? And so on. So this is consistent with what Jesus said on earth. And here he is talking to us in the ascended state. And you'll say, but wait a minute, this has been taken out of the NIV. Well, I did a whole episode showing you that they made a mistake, clearly, because we have two sources before they were relying upon the allegedly oldest text, which was the Codex Sinaiticus from about 330 to 350 Christian era, right? But they missed the fact that Cyprian and Tertullian both quoted in the 200s, early 200s to mid 200s, a century earlier. And it was there in two different sources. So you always go with the oldest. If it was in there and quoted in two different places, in two different regions, hey, you go with that. That's the thing you should say. That's the authoritative text. And so in the fact that it continued until the Textus Receptus, which is what the King James Bible is based on, shows you it had a long tradition thereafter. So what was going on in the Codex Sinaiticus? Why did it get rid of it? And I showed in that video that adding the words wash the robes required a huge amount of transformation of the verse, and deliberately then sponsored and was used to sponsor idea of infant baptism, which was something they could make money out of, or at least get people to be dependent on the church. Your kids have original sin according to Paul, and therefore you don't get baptized, you're going to go to hell if they die as a youth. So anyway, this is just another emphasis that Jesus is making on a conditional grace versus the antinomian answer that Paul always has is, don't even do anything, just believe in some facts and you're going to go to heaven. All right, let's continue. All right, so now this is a fifth proof out of the book of Revelation, chapter 2, where Jesus is going to talk about the deep things of Satan and what is he playing on in a mockery sense of Paul saying the same thing in the passages of the book, the very book he's talking about, where in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, Paul's allowing meat sacrificed idols. And he's calling it, he's introducing it, he's going to share these deep things of God. When Jesus is condemning it, he's going to look at this repulsive statement that these are the deep things of God and call them the deep things of Satan in the book of Revelation. So let's see how Jesus flips the switch on how Paul was trying to hold something up for admiration, which is from the pit of hell, this eating meat, sacrificed idols. So in the same book, in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, Paul's endorsing eating meat, sacrificed idols. What does Paul introduce this? 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 10, he says, the Spirit searches all things, even the depths, the bate of God. So Jesus, in the same context, he's condemning the eating meat, sacrificed idols, Revelation 2:24. He says this, to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, bate. And then he's going to compliment them. So they were doing good, and they were resisting the deep secrets, the bate of Satan. And that's what Jesus is calling Paul's doctrines. So you should really, I'd say, do a double take on that one for sure. So the subtitle here says it well. Jesus does not just disagree with Paul. He deliberately mocks Paul's specific vocabulary. What Paul calls the depths of God, Jesus reveals as the depths of Satan. Now, I have top Protestant scholarship who agrees these passages are potentially related. Jesus is condemning something that Paul is allowing, even though these are standard Protestant sources. InterVarsity Press New Testament Commentary Series, quote, possibly. With Paul's statement in view in 1 Corinthians 2:10, the risen Jesus announces not just to Thyatira but to all the churches, verse 23, that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds, your works, adding that the deep things of such groups as this are not the profound truths of God, but the deep secrets, the bate, the depths of Satan himself, verse 24. Now, why would the InterVarsity Press have that compulsion to have to admit that? Because it was very well explained by pro-Paul scholar Max Krenkel. Okay, he's the one who first made this connection, and he was using it to prove that the Apostolic Church were Judaizers and enemies of Christ. I've shown you already another reference to this in a different context. This is now the depths of Satan context. He's going to do the same thing here. And this is what he says in Der Apostel Johannes by Max Krenkel, Berlin, 1871. And I had it translated automatically by Google. While Paul once boasted of having penetrated the depths of the Godhead in 1 Corinthians 2:10, by virtue of the Spirit dwelling within them, John wants to consider what they truly perceived as only the depths of Satan, Revelation 2:24. Now, before I move on, I just want to show you, I explained Krenkel did this earlier when he was discussing other problems that Paul is being exposed in the book of Revelation. It wasn't Jesus saying it. It's now just John. If you pay attention, he says here, while Paul once boasted of having penetrated the depths of the Godhead by virtue of the Spirit dwelling within them, John wants to consider what they truly perceived as only the depths of Satan. No. It's Jesus wants us to consider that they're from the depths of Satan, not just John. This is Jesus speaking. But you see what they do is when Jesus is speaking, it's not authoritative. When Paul speaks, it's authoritative. That's what they do. And if someone wants to call him out, no, it was John, it was Judaizers, it was all these other Jewish Christians. That's how they do it. They demonize their enemy, and that's how they deflected it. That's not the way to do it. And they're demonizing even Jesus. He can't condemn eating meat sacrificed to idols, even though that's condemnable in the Torah and the Bible and everywhere else. We live in a dystopian Christian world. This is what they pull off on people. But this is also an admission that this text clearly screams out that whoever wrote this, and I believe it was Jesus to John, is condemning Paul absolutely categorically. And this Krenkel guy could only deflect it by changing it from Jesus speaking to John. Never narrated that Jesus is speaking to John. All right, so here's how all these topics can be brought together in 4 headings. Synthesizing the dossier, as it's put. Claimed to be an apostle in Asia, but was rejected. So that's problem number 1. This is proven by Ephesians 1:1, 2 Timothy 1:15, and Revelation 2:2. Below that, Paul promoted antinomian grace without works salvation. That's in Ephesians 2:8. It's also the Nicolaitans problem in Revelation 22:12. To the right, top, he taught that eating meat sacrificed to idols was permissible. That's in 1 Corinthians 8, and it's condemned in Revelation 2:14 and a couple of other places in Revelation 2. Paul boasted of knowing the depths, bate, of God in 1 Corinthians 2:10, which Jesus condemns as the bate, or the depths of Satan, in Revelation 2:24. All right, and at the bottom of this slide, it gives us the verdict. The false apostle, the Balaam doctrine, Nicolaitan heresy, and the depths of Satan are not separate historical anomalies. They are a precise, unified description of one historical figure, Paul of Tarsus. So I hope you can see so far that most of us, or many of us who are following Paul, have this choice to make, and you're on an irreconcilable path, meaning they're totally self-contradictory of each other. You can only pick one of these two. You cannot serve 2 masters. Jesus said you'll hate one, love the other. And path A will be the tradition of men, and path B will be the words of Christ. So let's look on the left side. What do you get when you go to the traditions of men? You get the prioritization of Paul's epistles. You maintain the faith alone paradigm, which doesn't get you to heaven. It's Gnosticism. You're having the depths of Satan. That's the mystery of Paul, is you're going to learn the depths of Satan. That's what Jesus is telling you. And you're going to reinterpret the Gospels and even the book of Revelation to always fit Paul's theology or deflect that it's about Jesus speaking in condemnation of Paul. That's what I've showed you over and over again is going on in the book of Revelation commentaries. Or go to path B. Why not go to path B? What's so bad about path B? The words of Christ. Prioritize the red letters, accept the biblical standard of evidence, test the prophets, submit to the conditional grace, and repentance demanded by Jesus Christ. What's the problem with that? Why can't you just accept a little bit of effort is necessary? It's faith and works. It's not just faith alone. You're not going to get to heaven by faith alone. Justification, James makes it very clear to help you out. Justification is by works and not by faith alone. So that's assuming if you had faith alone. Are you going to get justified without your works? No. So just you say the Bible's inerrant, so why don't you try to treat that as a valid biblical text? James 2:24. So let's see what the key insight is here. The greatest test of a Christian's fidelity is what they do when the words of an apostle collides with the words of the master. So here's my final exhortation to everyone. Restoring the primacy of the red letters. Christianity was never meant to be the religion of Paul. It is the kingdom of Jesus Christ. Our mandate is clear. Return to the foundational teachings of the 12. Return to the Sermon on the Mount. Return to the unbroken, unadulterated words of Jesus. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Matthew 24, verse 35. I pray each one of you will seriously study, and if you question anything here, please put a comment, ask me a question about it. I'm glad to take time to do that and try to make a decision for Christ today. Don't wait. The world seems to be getting closer and closer to the end. So why take any moment to think you can get away with what you're getting away with now if that's what you realize you're doing and you're trying to skate in with just faith alone? And when you can see clear as day, that's not going to work. God will not be mocked. You cannot outdo God. If he says one thing, you cannot turn to another person and say, that's the guy I'm going to listen to. I'm not going to listen. He says he's from God, so I'm going to listen to him because he says he's from God. No, you're listening to Paul only because he gives you the easy way. But Jesus says broad is the way that leads to destruction and easy is the way that leads to death. But difficult and narrow and straight is the way that leads to life. And there are few there that find it. All right. God bless. Ciao. Bye.